Thanks, Wendy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony Bergantino. I'm the director of the Wyoming State Climate Office and the Water Resources Data System. We're glad you were able to join with us on this Conditions and Outlook webinar. It's being presented by my office, along with the Department of Environmental Quality, the U.S. Geological Survey, the State Engineer's Office, National Weather Service, Bureau of Land Management, and USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub and University of Wyoming Extension. And today we'll be looking at current drought and climate conditions. I'll talk a little, I'll try to keep it to a little, about the continuing La Nina, and we'll get an update on surface water conditions, water rights administration, a presentation on HCBs or harmful cyanobacterial blooms. And then we'll look forward again with some weather forecasts and some wildland fire outlooks. So looking at current conditions, this is hot off the presses from this morning and covers through Tuesday the 13th. It's the current drought map. Areas in red deteriorated since our last webinar. And this large area of green is an improvement resulting from last week's precipitation in the northern part of the state. The red areas in the northeast had been degraded prior to the precipitation and did not receive enough last week to warrant improvements. So they're still staying in the D1 category. Here is our 14-day total precipitation as a percentile. West of the divide and the southeast have missed out in the last 2 weeks, while the north central, northeast has had some welcome precipitation, including some snows that you can see on the map down here in the lower left that happened around the 10th, 11th or so of this month, the first snows of the season. This is a new slide I wanted to throw in here, given the circumstances that we had. The upper left map is the 7-day precipitation total. We're again looking at the 14-day here as the large map, but the upper left one here is the first 7 days of that period, and the lower one is the last 7 days of that period. And you can see quite a difference. And yes, the first week of September was very dry. And this is the same map, but looking at 90 days, much of the west, as well as the south central parts of the southeast and far northeast stand out as being below the median, with the north central and other parts of the northeast showing somewhat above median precipitation over that 90-day period. This is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, or quickly known as the SPEI. Being a bit more involved in a simple precip map, so just my 20-second explanation of how it's created. The SPEI is an index that's calculated using precipitation and evapotranspiration data. It gives you a better idea of the fuller water balance compared to just looking at precipitation by itself. Since it's an index, you don't have a physical precipitation amount shown on the map, but rather values that go from about a -2 on the low side to up over a +2 on the high side. And those values represent the number of standard deviations away from the median value of precipitation that the current conditions are in for that area. The negative part of the scale indicates dryness, and the positive side means you're in wetter conditions. And so these maps show 30 and 60-day time frames across the top and 1 year on the bottom right, actually. And we're seeing some areas of concern here in the 30-day, much of the west, the south central, as well as some lingering parts in the far southeast. And on the wet side, we have the bighorns from that precipitation that we got here last week and those first snows of the season. Looking at temperature for the last 14 days, this is the minimum temperature over that 2-week period. Nighttime lows, looking up here on the upper right, which is actual temperature, are starting to dip a little bit below freezing at night in a few isolated areas. Looking at the lower left here is the departure from normal for the minimum temperature, and generally around the state it was 3 to 6 degrees above average. Some scattered areas, not very many of them, were in up to 3 degrees Fahrenheit below the average. Switch to the other side of the thermometer and look at the maximum temperatures. Again, absolute temperatures up here on the upper right, greater than 60 degrees statewide for average temperature, with mid 80s to upper 80s and the lower elevations in the west and the high plains out here on the eastern plains. Looking at the lower left here, we have the departure from normal for the average maximum temperature. And the west was warm, 9 to 12 degrees above average. And there's red parts and a little bit up here on the eastern side of the Bighorns. Rest of Wyoming, about 6 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit above average, except southern part of Laramie County, a little into Albany, and a few other scattered pockets around the state that were 3 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit above the average. Moving underground and looking at soil moisture percentiles, this shows that we have a pretty good demarcation here between north and south, with roughly the southern or a bit less than half of the state at the 10th percentile or less. Conditions in almost all areas except the Powder Tongue Basin have remained the same, or in many areas gotten worse in the last 2 weeks. And in some areas that degradation has been substantial. You can see over here, we're in the 60th and 70th percentile up here in the Park County area, and we've dropped considerably here, and same with here in the far southwest. We're down in the 10th, where we were up in the 30th to 40th just 2 weeks ago. And here is the percentage of Wyoming in each category of drought from the year 2000 to present. We've had now for 113 weeks, some part of Wyoming that has been in D3 or the extreme drought category. The area of state in D1 to D4 did increase or decrease by almost 1% since the last webinar. And it's now at 53.81% of the state being in actual drought conditions. D0 is not a drought condition, it's just abnormally dry, but being in D1 to D4 is the lowest percentage of area that we've had in Wyoming being in actual drought conditions since the 14th of July in 2020, when we were moving into this current drought period. And again, given the size of Wyoming, you might want to look at this timeline for your specific area, and these maps do exist for each individual county, and they can be found down here on the link on the lower left. Now let's zoom in here, as we always do, and show from the start of 2020 to present. Again, only 1.59% of the state is in extreme drought, and that's sort of remained the same for the last 5 or 6 weeks. And it's unchanged since our last webinar. The amount of state with no D category whatsoever is at 13.33%, and that's the greatest percentage of the state being drought and abnormally dry free since the 28th of July in 2020. Again, when we were moving into this period here where the drought picked up. So now let's look at La Nina. It is looking more likely that the winter will feature a third occurrence of La Nina conditions. And La Nina occurs when the waters of the equatorial Pacific are about at a half degree Celsius or more below average. And that cooling in temperature has to be forecasted to persist for at least 3 consecutive months. If those conditions continue into the winter of 22-23, it will only be the 3rd time since 1950 that we've had 3 La Nina winters in a row. The other 2 times were the winters of 73-74 through 75-76 and 98-99 through 2000 and 2001. While La Nina's opposite phase, El Nino, has been recognized for centuries by the fishermen of Peru and Chile, because of the warm waters there affecting the fishing there, making for fishing. The counterpart, or La Nina, was only discovered in the 80s, though like El Nino, it has been going on for thousands of years. And what causes this? Well, it's the cooling of the ocean there results from stronger than normal trade winds blowing westward across the equator. And this pushes the warm water to the west, allowing this deeper, colder water to rise or upwell to the surface. And that's what gives us these colder sea surface temperatures. And the effects of La Nina, well, all this modifies the behavior of the jet streams. It strengthens the northern jet, taking it far north before then dipping again into the US, bringing the colder air with it. At the same time, the southern or subtropical jet that comes across through here is weakened, which impedes the moisture coming into the southwestern US. And the overall effect is you get generally colder conditions in the north, generally drier and warmer conditions across the south, and generally wetter conditions in the northwest. Generally. The problem is that the boundaries between these influences are not just straight lines or a single line here. You can't just say north of this line it'll be colder, south of this line it'll be drier, here it will be wetter. It's more of a region which shifts from year to year and through the season. So knowing exactly where it's going to be cooler and where it's going to be drier is not as easy as one would hope. To illustrate that, let's look at some maps of different periods. And these aren't meant to be looked at in detail, but rather sort of an overview, sort of a bird's eye view of all the years so that you can just kind of eyeball it out. These are conditions during various 3-month periods during La Niñas. The first of these that we're showing is total precipitation reserve that fell for the December through February time period for each La Nina year compared to, I took a 1921 to 2020 average, so a 100-year period, and then calculated the departure of each of these particular La Nina month triplets to see what the difference was. And so these maps are individual La Nina years, and they're ranked from the strength of the La Nina in that year. And the strength lessens as you go left to right, and as you go down from strong to moderate to weak. And as you can see, there's quite a variety, which does not seem to relate to the strength. You got a lot of dry moisture here and over here, and with just a little bit difference in strength. You got dry and dry. So it's not always, as I was saying, you can't just say it's going to be wetter here or it's going to be drier here. This one is December through February again, but this is the average temperature compared to the 21 to 20 average. And again, it's pretty variable. You have two fairly strong La Ninas in 88 and 89, or 88 and 99 actually. And the former is above average and the latter is below average temperature. So again, you can't just say that because it's this time period in La Nina, it's going to be colder. And this is precipitation. We're looking at here at the January through February period, and it's showing the same variability. And not to really belabor the point, but let's look at temperature and for that same period, January to March. And again, you can see quite a bit of variation. So how do you make any sense out of it? Well, let's use some statistics. When you have the variability that you do and the effects, one thing you can do to make some sort of sense out of them is to look at these in terms of probabilities. And this is the same principle behind the outlooks that you'll see a little bit later. Instead of saying it will be this or it'll be that, you look at it in terms of leaning towards this or more likely that. The odds are that this will happen, or that there are better chances of this versus something else. So what I've done here is taken those, there were 86 total maps that I showed before, and along with about 80 to 90 others from 2 other time frames in the winter, and created the following 8 depictions. And these maps show the percent of times during La Nina years that precipitation or temperature was above average. So for precipitation, if there was a higher percentage of years where conditions were above average, those years are going to be the green side on the map, and lower percentage of above average precipitation will show up as brown. For the temperatures, you'll see the colors as red and blue for the higher and low percentages of normal temperature. To get a feel of how the time period was for the lower 48 states as a whole, we have this smaller scale map on the right. And for a bit more detail on Wyoming, we have this larger scale map here on the upper left. And this set of maps is going to be for precipitation for the, well, this set here is for the precipitation for the November, January timeframe. And as we get into the others, we'll step forward 3-month times per slide. And you can see there's a greater percentage of below average years to the south and southwest, while in other areas, Northwest especially, have a higher percentage of wetter than average years. On the Wyoming map, you can see these areas in a little bit better detail. The deeper the green, the higher the percentage of wet years, so the more likely it's going to be wet conditions during this time period. The deeper the brown, the lower the percent of wet years. Or another way of looking at it, there's going to be a high percentage of years where it was a below average precipitation. And the percentage for these sets of maps is based upon between 20 and 24 total La Nina years, using years between 1950 and the current ones that we're in. We'll move into the December to February time period. The deepness of the green fades in many areas. Well, the extent of the brown increases, though not necessarily the intensity or the better chances that it will be below normal precipitation. Moving to January, February, March timeframe, you can see the areas jump out with a much higher percentage of above average precipitation in the Northwest, and conversely, in the Southwest, Southern Bighorn Basin have some deeper browns, indicating a greater percentage of La Nina years having below normal precipitation there. And then one more on precipitation. We move to the February through March time period, or April time period. And if we are still in La Nina at the time, and the forecast for this time frame is actually neutral instead of La Nina, we would be seeing deeper greens in the Northwest again. And while the Southern Bighorn Basin is more average compared to January through March, the Southeast shows a higher percentage of below average precipitation years. Now we'll move into temperature, and going into late fall, early winter, you can see a leaning toward the warmth that we've been seeing, stronger in the deeper reddish areas with a little tendency towards cooler than average in the far Northeast. And stepping forward another triplet set of months to the December, January, February time period, Fremont County and Southwest show a somewhat higher number of years, or average of La Nina years being warmer than average, while the below average in the Northeast expands a little bit here. This is the influence of that Arctic jet coming down out of the Northwest. Moving into January, February, March, somewhat similar pattern to this period. The percentages above and below are not as extreme, indicating a pretty good mix of above and below average years during this time frame. Some parts of the Southwest tended to have a few more years with above average temperatures, but not significantly much. And then last of these, moving to the February through April time, we're currently looking at conditions to be neutral, but although the sea surface temperatures are still expected to be below average, they're just not going to be in La Nina threshold the way they're currently forecasted. The La Nina in this time frame would show a tendency toward below normal temperatures across much of the state, especially in the Northwest, although the percentage is also a bit higher in the Southeast as well. So what does all this mean for Wyoming in the months to come? Well, the odds are increasing that La Nina will persist into early and even midwinter. In early August, the January through March timeframe had even chances of being La Nina or neutral conditions, but now a month later, the odds favor La Nina for that time period, and those chances flip when you go to the next period, which is February through April. And during that time, now it's being more favored to be neutral conditions rather than either La Nina or El Nino. So for the next few months, since about November to January timeframe, I'd expect above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation, at least in the southern parts of the state. Better chances for above average precipitation, especially in the Northwest as we get into the winter months. If La Nina weakens as expected, as we move deeper into 2023, its influence becomes less, which makes forecasting a bit less certain. You start to rely on climatology, like what is the average conditions for this time period, and that kind of guides your decisions. So, what are normal conditions like? And hopefully that means that we will be seeing more normal conditions in late winter and going into spring. Climate Prediction Center outlooks going into next summer, which is a bit ways out there, are showing a leaning toward and even a likelihood of above normal temperatures in the West. But again, that's you're looking at several months, so things could change depending on how La Nina weakens and if it decides to go to the opposite side, and the waters there get warmer, moving us into El Nino conditions, which could bring us a whole nother set of interesting things. But with that, I will now turn this over to Aaron Piachetti with the USGS, who will talk about surface water conditions.
Thanks, Tony. Well, here's a snapshot from the National Water Information Dashboard that shows current conditions as of yesterday, and the radar imagery is on there, so it makes it a little bit harder to see. But in general, it's not quite as rosy as what was presented last year. And in the categories here, is the green is what's considered normal conditions. That's the 25th to the 75th percentile. So that's what they consider normal. There's a little bit of darker blue that's above normal conditions, or the lighter and darker blues, those are above normal, above the 75th percentile. And then down in the southeast, you'll see some browns, so it's our below normal, that 25th to 10th percentile essentially, and then the dark reds is much below normal. And then we have two stations that are bright red, and that shows a record daily low. The one is the Sweetwater River, and then the Medicine Bow above Seminole. So those were set yesterday as record daily lows for the period of record. In general, if you surf around on that map, you see a lot of green, and if you look, generally things are pretty close to the median. So things look pretty good, but the caveat being that this is not normally a time of water abundance. We're kind of trending into winter-based flows. Well, hopefully as things cool down, water use should be decreasing, water demand from riparian areas and things will slow down. So there should be more water, and then we'll see hopefully fall precipitation, and that provides some hopefully relief from low stream flows as we approach winter ice up. So just to bounce around the state a little bit, up here in the northwest, the North Fork of Shoshone at Wapiti, just looking in from August into September here, seeing some spikes from precipitation events there in August, and we've had one here recently in September. But in general, the flows are pretty close to the median. Things look pretty good there, and you kind of see looking forward into September and October, you'll see the range of higher flows gets a little bit higher, and that's kind of from those storms that would be coming through and dropping some snow maybe in the high country. They'll melt off or precip down low, and then we kind of slowly decrease into November and winter as things freeze up, and the contributions are strictly from groundwater. So we'll hopefully have some more water in that neck of the woods and throughout as we go forward. But right now, things look generally pretty good in the northwest. Moving over to the Powder near Arvada, this time in August, September, the flows can basically essentially be zero, and that's kind of completely normal for that site. But right now there's flow over there. And when you kind of consider, even though it's somewhere around 20, 30 CFS, that's pretty close to the median, and things look okay for the system there. Moving over to the North Platte, the state line, heavily regulated river at that location. It looks like some water's been being moved through the system downstream at the end of August into September, and now the flows have been decreased and into that. They're a little bit above the median right there right now, but that's the state of the conditions right there. And then moving over to Green River below Fontenelle, another regulated system. Flows have been generally held steady since beginning of July, with a little bit of a spike there in August, but and it looks like maybe conditions, the flows have been decreased slightly here as of recent, but in general, within that realm of normal and pretty close to the median. And just to take a look at that Sweetwater at the next slide here, Sweetwater River near Sweetwater Station, through essentially since the beginning of the calendar year, this site has had very low conditions, hanging in that much below normal to near the 5th percentile through when runoff should have been occurring. I mean, flows did increase over that period, but it wasn't what it normally should be. And then that just continued to trend here till into September, where you see that black line go below that 5th percentile. And that's where we starting to set these daily record lows for the site. So quite dry conditions in there. And that's kind of, stream flows are generally aligning well with the drought conditions and precipitation deficits in the Southwest, with the caveat of where regulation releases have occurred from reservoirs. So moving on to reservoirs, just a comparison with all the teacup diagrams between September 15th and last year. In general, across the state, reservoirs have decreased in storage. There's been some pretty significant decreases in Palisades, Jackson, Buffalo Bill, Pathfinder, and Fontenelle, and that makes sense, as we're not at a time of great water supply, so folks would be drawing on their reservoirs as operations are needed to fulfill water users or to move water for other operational needs downstream. But if you looked at the reservoirs in a Jackson Lake and Palisades, they're really quite low, and they never got up very high this year to begin with, but they've been drafting on them pretty well lately. So, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Now we'll go to Jeff Cowley with the State Engineer's Office to talk about water rights administration.
Good afternoon, everybody. As you can see here, we're displaying our 4 different hydrographers. So if you have specific questions that I go over too quickly, you can maybe jot these numbers down here and call your specific superintendent to get your questions answered. So if we could go to the next slide, Tony. As you can see here in Division 1, we are continuing the summer call from the Bureau that limits our North Platte main stem diverters to the 6,600 acre feet every 2 weeks. That call will go off on September 30th. And as you can see, there are still some calls, Horseshoe Creek and the Laramie River back to the 1800s. Next slide, Tony. Again, here's another Laramie call. There's Laramie River is a highly regulated stream in Wyoming, and as you can see, there were 3 separate calls on it, and another 2 on Rattlesnake Creek here back to still territorial days. Next slide. Division 2. Again, lots of calls, but if you remember from last month, there are some that have come off. Part of that is there is no water to fight over anymore, so there are no calls, but in certain areas there are still calls on some of these rivers, like Big Goose, Little Goose, Piney Creek, Upper and Lower Clear Creek. Next slide. And a couple of these, they are releasing stored water out of reservoirs for people to be able to finish up their crops for the year. So Dull Knife, Willow Park, and Cloud Peak. And then we have a couple more calls, one on Wolf Creek and then on the Powder River. Next slide. Division 3. Again, some of the same calls that have been on all summer, but there are a few less. There are a few creeks that I did delete off here. So Owl Creek, Grass Creek, Gooseberry, and Grable River, all in the late 1800s, early 1900 calls. Next slide. And then here to finish up, Cottonwood, Medicine Lodge Creek, Big or Middle Paposia, and the Nowood River kind of rounds out Division 3. So on to Division 4. We have a couple interstate calls you'll see here. The first one being the Central Bear, that came on beginning of the season and is still on. We have one on Fish Creek, the Blacks Fork River here, number 3. There is a direct flow call to 1891 and they are also delivering Meeks Cabin water down that drainage. South Pine Creek, and then Smith's Fork again, there's a 1935 call for the direct flow, and they are releasing that state land reservoir water down the system to finish people off for the year. So last slide. Corral Creek, another interstate call on the Upper Bear, and then Teton Creek is another interstate called the Roxana Decree, which is the smallest decree in the state, but is still important because we do get calls to regulate that system. Just to close out, Tony, if you go to the last slide, back in my surface water days, you could just about put all of our phone calls into two buckets. One was, could you please turn the stream on because it's drying up, or could you turn it off because it's coming through the front door? As you can imagine now, most of our calls and meetings are dealing with creeks that are drying up, and what can you do about it, Mr. State Engineer? And we try and remind people that when it hasn't rained or snowed in about 2 years, it makes it tough for us to do anything. So do a rain dance, do a snow dance, hope for the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And now we have Kelsey Hirschman with the Department of Environmental Quality to talk about HCBs. Kelsey?
Thanks, Tony. Temperature, precipitation, drought conditions, and stream flow are all really relevant when thinking about HCBs, so it's good to have a brief overview and update of what's going on in the state. I'll give you an overview of HCBs and our program before I chat about what we are finding in the state. HCBs are dense concentrations of cyanobacteria. They are also known as blue-green algae. Cyanobacteria are unicellular photosynthetic organisms. They can be found in the water and on land. Today, we're going to be chatting about cyanobacteria that are found in the water. They can be green, tan, or brown, and they can leave a blue-green paste along the shoreline as they decompose. They can appear as surface gums, clumps, or they can be diffused within the water column. You're looking at a few pictures of what they may look like. They may look like dots or grass clippings within the water. They may look more like cottage cheese, or they can look like spilled paint along the surface of the water. And they're important to think about because they produce toxins that can affect the nervous system, liver, kidneys, and skin. And with these toxins and their nuisance appearance, they can affect tourism, recreation, drinking water, agriculture, and wildlife. Next slide. So what cause harmful cyanobacteria blooms? You can think of them like a plant. They prefer abundant light, high temperatures, and excess nutrients. Cyanobacteria are naturally occurring in water ecosystems. However, during these conditions, they proliferate and form dense blooms. However, we have found them in the water, in the winter, so they can exist in the wintertime. We tend to see harmful cyanobacteria blooms occur in the state from late June through fall, November. So in order to identify harmful cyanobacteria blooms in Wyoming waters and inform the public and collaborators about potential health risks associated with these blooms, the Department of Environmental Quality has worked closely with the Department of Health to develop an action plan for these publicly accessible water bodies in Wyoming. We also work closely with the Wyoming Livestock Board, resource management agencies, including Wyoming Game and Fish Department, the Forest Service, state parks, and other stakeholders to inform our program. Our action plan is on our webpage, wyohcbs.org. You can learn more about our surveillance and reporting, data collection, and triggers that the Department of Health uses to issue advisories, as well as lifting advisories. There are currently a lot of blooms that we're aware of in the state of Wyoming. The Wyoming Department of Health issues bloom advisories of when cyanobacteria abundance exceeds our 20,000 cells per milliliter threshold, which is established in our action plan. Here's a map of all of the current bloom advisories in the state of Wyoming. Currently, there are 38 bloom advisories for different water bodies in Wyoming. Last year, at the end of the season, we had found a total of 28 blooms in publicly accessible water bodies. This increase to 38 blooms is due to an increase of collaboration and additional eyes on the ground, more people finding these blooms in the state and collecting samples in coordination with us. Next slide. There are so many, I couldn't list them all on one slide, so I split the state into Western and Eastern Wyoming. In Eastern Wyoming, you'll see a large amount of advisories for water bodies on the Shoshone National Forest near Du Bois. The Shoshone Forest Service has done a great effort of looking for and collecting samples in these water bodies when they do find harmful cyanobacteria blooms. And we have been surprised at how many of these water bodies are having harmful cyanobacterial blooms. Other water bodies to note with blooms that are highly recreated include Basin Reservoir, Flaming Gorge Reservoir. These two water bodies have had seasonal advisories for harmful cyanobacteria blooms since 2017 when our program began. Next slide. In Eastern Wyoming, you can see a lot of harmful cyanobacteria blooms we've found in water bodies in the southern, southeastern Wyoming. Some water bodies that are highly recreated in southeastern Wyoming include Keyhole Reservoir has had a bloom advisory, Alcova and Pathfinder, as well as Granite Springs Reservoir, just west of Cheyenne. A lot of these water bodies with bloom advisories, we routinely monitor by between bi-weekly or monthly monitoring at the higher recreated water bodies. And during this monitoring, we'll collect cyanobacteria samples as well as toxin samples. And the Department of Health issues a toxin advisory when toxins exceed recreational thresholds. These are outlined in the action plan as well. Current toxin advisories in the state include a toxin advisory for Diamond Lake, which is near Arlington, Eden Reservoir, north of Rock Springs, Goshen Hole Reservoir in southeastern Wyoming, Leelanby Lake, south of Laramie, Saratoga Lake, and Upper Brooks Lake, which is also on the Shoshone National Forest. And this is the first lake on National Forest higher elevation lake that we have found elevated toxin concentrations in. So it is a big deal. And you can find more information on these advisories and the sample results, the concentration of toxin found at wyohcbs.org. So if you do encounter a bloom, the Department of Health advises that you do not swim or come into contact with that water. Do not ingest the water from the bloom. Boiling water with an HCB and filters do not remove the toxins. If you're fishing, rinse the fish with clean water and eat only the filleted portion. If it's a windy Wyoming day, avoid water spray from the bloom. Do not allow your pets or livestock near water with an HCB. Scum can also be accumulated along the shoreline. Do not allow them to eat the bloom material. After they swim, wash them off and don't let them lick their fur after contact. If you do find a bloom at a water body that does not already have an advisory, please report the bloom to DEQ through our spills and complaint system. This can also be found through a link on our wyohcbs.org. You can also report any HCB related illnesses to the Department of Health, and these reports are confidential. I think that is all I have today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have. Wendy will provide you with my email. If you have any questions about specific water bodies in the state, please give me an email. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey. Now let's switch gears and look forward again, and with forecasts and outlooks, and Tony Anderson with the National Weather Service in Cheyenne.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you, Tony. Good afternoon to all of you. not a terribly exciting upcoming week. The temperatures are going to be seasonal to above normal through Tuesday. And then we're expecting cooler air to move in later in the week and that could possibly bring freezing temperatures to the high country in the west, especially the Yellowstone area. We're looking at increased precipitation from today through Saturday, then a drying period, and then we'll pick up again with precipitation next week in the midweek in the Tuesday to Thursday time frame. As you can see, there's some significant precipitation potential coming up especially in the Northwest, with 1.25 inches to 1.75 inches of potential precipitation forecast in the Yellowstone area. And then the Wind Rivers look like they could pick up another healthy dose. Otherwise, it looks fairly seasonable with regard to the precipitation totals for the next week. Next slide, please. Looking in the 6 to 10 day temperature and precipitation outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. The temperature outlooks is not showing a terribly strong signal. We have a moderate above normal temperature signal in the southeast corner of the state, and that weakens to neutral as you move up towards the northwest and the Yellowstone area. The precipitation outlook is there's a moderate signal for above normal precipitation covering most of the state, and that would coincide with the precipitation outlook we saw in the last slide. The moderate signal is a little bit weaker to the east end of the state, especially into the northeast, but there is still a weak above normal signal in those areas. Next slide. Stretching it out a little bit further to the 14-day time period. Very easy to interpret the temperature outlook. The entire state has a moderate signal for above normal temperatures, which for those of us who like a longer warm period, that's probably a good thing, although it doesn't help the drought. The precipitation outlook, again, not terribly diverse with regard to the state of Wyoming. We have a below normal precip signal for all of Wyoming. It's a weak signal in most of the state, but along the northern border with Montana and in Idaho and South Dakota, it strengthens to a moderate signal. Next slide. Jumping out to a 3-month outlook, these are the seasonal outlooks provided by CPC once again, and Tony mentioned that he looked at these extending out into the spring. On the temperature side, we have an above normal signal for almost all of Wyoming. Just a tiny corner of the northeast part of the state has really no signal or equal chances for above, below, and normal temperatures. But the southern part of the state has a moderate above normal signal. And then, of course, it transitions in the middle part of the state from the northwest to the east central is a weak above normal signal. Looking at precipitation, a little more clear on this one. There's probably a very weak below normal precipitation signal for the next 3 months. But for the bulk of the state, there is no signal, meaning there's equal chances for above normal, below normal, or normal precipitation. Next slide, please. I think that's I'm done. And I'll pass it back to Tony so we can talk about fuel moistures and energy release.
And Casey Cheesebro with the Bureau of Land Management will be here to talk about those fuel moistures and energy release. Casey?
Good afternoon, everybody. So this first slide I've just kept in there, I think, since last year. I know we have some new participants that come in, and it's not language that a lot of people are used to talking about. So just wanted to real quick kind of highlight. So one of the terms I'll use, just because it's a good metric to kind of track, especially on this once a month time frame, is energy release component, ERC value. And that's basically a combination or a composite of these different time lag fuel moistures, the 1 hour, 10 hour, and 100 hour and 1000 hour fuels that we talk about. And basically those timeframes, to really simplify it, just have to do with how quickly those fuels dry out. So your 1 hour fuels would be your grasses, very small twigs, 0 to 1/4 inch. Obviously those are going to receive moisture and let go of moisture pretty quickly in that 1 hour time frame. 10 hour, looking at 1/4 to 1 inch, so some of your twigs and smaller branches. And then into the 100 hour fuels, 1 inch to 3 inch, your dead fuels, 1 inch to 3 inch, so your branches, and going into bigger limbs and things. And then 1,000 hours being anything above that 3 inch range, so more of the logs or heavy timber. So with that, those are all dead fuels. So then on top of that, we'll talk a little bit about live fuel moistures, which is a lot more impacted obviously by the soil moisture that they're getting moisture through their root systems, and then some seasonal tendencies or seasonal curing that goes on too, is just part of the natural cycle for those fuels. So next slide, Tony. So with that, just a map, pulled data from yesterday for the ERCs around the map, or around Wyoming, sorry. These are the energy release components, pretty simple graphic, but these are all of our remote weather stations that we pull data from around the state. And so really when it comes to looking at fire danger and how we make decisions regarding fire, allocation of fire resources and readiness, we really key in on that 90th percentile and above. And there's none of those maroon or purple circles on the map as of right now, which is kind of crazy for mid-September, typically a pretty dry time of year in a lot of places here. So anything that's green, that's really a good sign for this time of year for fire danger. Even the yellow we wouldn't view as very, very alarming, and even orange, we don't see much for orange, but it does kind of line up with what folks were saying about that southern part of Wyoming being a little bit drier, especially southeastern Wyoming. So all in all, really from that, for mid-September, pretty good news really from a fire danger standpoint. Some of that, as folks talked about already, not only moisture in a pretty regular pattern across the state, but also pretty substantial. I know last year we talked a lot about, we didn't get a lot of moisture, but it just came at the right time, kept things kind of moderated. Kind of seeing the same thing this year, but even more amount of moisture or amount of precipitation here lately. So keeping things pretty moderate. Of course, with that, I do put a caveat there that we are also growing a lot of grass, which is good for most things. Certainly don't want to knock that in Wyoming, but it does mean a high fuel load potentially that if we don't deal with it this fall, maybe something that comes into play next spring as things dry out. So let's see, sorry, Tony, I had one more bullet there. Wanted to just hit on that for just this time of year as we get into day length, obviously cooler temperatures, but really that day length. So we talk about the 1 hour and 10 hour fuels. We're starting to get to that point where it cools down enough at night, and it's hard for even those 10 hour fuels to do much. Sorry, call coming in. But for those 10 hour fuels to do much drying or to fully dry out during the day, especially as we get even shorter days. So that starts to help us out quite a bit this time of year. All right, next slide, Tony. So just pulled a few of these graphs, ERC graphs across kind of a sample size, I guess, or a sampling across Wyoming. So this was the Medicine Bow, big chunk of southeastern Wyoming there, the Sierra Madres and Snowy Range, showing pretty good, everybody, I think statewide, we saw that kind of warm, dry period of weather that really let things climb up to where we're probably starting to get fairly concerned there for a little bit, but now cooler, more moisture coming in. Last 2 weeks or so, we're seeing a pretty good drop off now, so well below that 90th percentile, still a little bit above average, which is that gray squiggly line down there at the bottom is the average. So we're still sitting a little above average down there, but not overall not real concerning at the moment in the Medicine Bow. Next slide. One thing I'm just realizing now, I didn't update the header on this slide. I apologize. So this is not the energy release component in this graph. I did want to pull in. So this is the 100-hour fuel moisture graph also for the Medicine Bow. So you can see how it's kind of an inverse of the ERCs, because the higher fuel moisture would be less fire behavior. So a higher ERC would be more fire behavior, higher fuel moisture, less fire behavior. So it's a little bit upside down, but tracks pretty close with what you guys saw on the ERC graph as well. Same thing, pretty strong decline there prior to the last 2 weeks, and then bouncing back up with some of the more recent moisture here recently. So back up again, still a little below average in this one, but not real concerning at the moment. So you'll notice some pretty good variability. Obviously with the 100-hour fuel moistures, they're hard to discuss on a once a month time frame because they do change quite a bit within that monthly period. So I did include on one of these charts coming up 1,000-hour fuel moisture too. You can see that's just a little smoother graph and a little better for tracking a trend. But next slide, Tony. So going to the other corner of the state, up in the Shoshone National Forest, in that area, again, a lot of the things that were already covered weather-wise, but we did peak out there just for a little bit in that 97th percentile. Those are pretty elevated conditions, so everybody was on pretty high alert there for a little while, but pretty strong drop off here recently. The last couple of weeks, really, we had that hot, dry period just for a little while, and then fell off pretty hard. So well below average for ERCs in the Shoshone. Things are looking pretty good up there. So here's that, mentioned that 1,000-hour fuel moisture graph. So you can just see just kind of a lot less variability than the 100-hour. So this is just really good when we're talking once a month, a pretty good graph to show kind of how fuels track throughout the summer. And then as we start talking, later season, more of the timber fires and those types of things that we've seen in the past, always bring up things like the Mullen Fire or even Cameron Peak being south of the state line, but still pretty close to Wyoming, as being fires that burn really actively in the fall. And that was largely due to these 1,000-hour fuel moistures being super low at that time. And right now we're looking pretty good. They're bouncing up pretty good. I expect we'll see that line continue to go up and probably even hit that average here with the expected weather coming up. So. And going now to another corner of the state, just up in the southwestern portion of the Black Hills, a little bit into South Dakota, but that Newcastle area here in Wyoming, really seeing kind of the same thing with the ERCs. Again, that big drying period that got us up really elevated. Got pretty concerned there for a little bit, and then here in the last 2 weeks or so, again, just falling off pretty hard. Things climbed again, but of course with the weather that we're getting right now, I'd say is probably going to make the turn and head down again here in the next few days. I would think we'll see that start to trend back down and probably closer to average here fairly soon. And going to the southwest part of the state in the Great Divide Basin, really just a little bit of a repeat. So again, big hot dry period and a couple shots of rain and cooler weather. Things looking really good down below average in those areas. So, kind of covers different corners of the state anyway, and without hitting every little area in between. But next slide, Tony. So looking out nationally at seasonal outlooks going forward, they did, I think this comes out the first of the month, so it just comes out once a month. So by the middle of the month, we're a little outdated, but I'd say when you're looking nationally, they nailed it pretty well. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, California, that's where a lot of the smoke's been coming in from here in the last couple of weeks that folks I'm sure have been experiencing different parts of the state. So they pretty well nailed that for early September at least. I know some of those fires did receive some moisture, so things should be hopefully moderating out there a little bit as well. But back to Wyoming, not seeing any real predicted elevated fire conditions for Wyoming either in September or October. So good news there. With that, we go into October. So this is September into October, obviously hunting season in Wyoming. So we typically see an uptick in fire starts just as people are out hunting, getting cold, lighting little warming fires and leaving those behind. So we'll probably see an increase in new starts, but with all the information we just talked about, I'm not seeing a lot of potential statewide for large fires. Only large fire really right now ongoing in Wyoming is the Washakie Park fire around Fort Washakie, and pretty minimal growth on that fire the last couple of days as well. So under that hot dry period was able to to grow fairly rapidly for a couple days, but not seeing a whole lot of fire activity on that fire now. And really nationally, we talked last month, there's still quite a few resources available. It has been busy up in the Northwest and Northern California, but if we were to get a big fire in Wyoming right now, we'd still have pretty high availability of those national resources, the aircraft and crews and things like that. Speaking of aircraft, Kelsey, I really appreciate the HCB discussion. That's something we've been starting to talk more about in the fire community, as well as we pull water out of these water sources and drop it out of helicopters near personnel. So thanks for jumping on and sharing that information too. Tony, I can't remember if I don't think there's another slide. I think that's all I've got.
No, that's all you've got.
Okay. All right. Thanks,
Very
Tony.
much. All right, and just a quick recap on the U.S. Drought Monitor. That large area up there in green was improvement since our last webinar. It was mostly a result of that pretty widespread precipitation we had up there in the northern part of the state last week. And again, those areas that are red up there just didn't get enough of the moisture to be improved. Those degraded after the last webinar and just did not get improved after the precipitation up there. So with that, I will conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank again all of our presenters whose names and affiliations are shown on the slide here. And on behalf of all of them, we'd like to express our appreciation to all of you for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Wendy Kelly, again with the University of Wyoming and USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub. And she'll take us into Q&A for the 2 minutes we've got left.